How does an immortal being deal with death? Welcome to the Immortal Gifts Podcast, where Dave Robison, Veronica Giguerre, and J Daniel Sawyer read my novel, Immortal Gifts, to you. I'm Catherine Filliard, and I wrote this. This episode of the Immortal Gifts Podcast is sponsored by me. If you like the podcast, tell your friends. If you've run out of friends to tell, buy the book. It's available in ebook, paperback, hardcover, large print, and audio. I also have a Patreon and a Ko-fi, if that's your thing. Impatient? The audiobook is available at my shop and my Patreon and will be headed to all the places audiobooks are sold. And with that, on to the show.
The Rule of Law. Abraham, Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey, October 18th, 2020. Ludwig came in and waved to Destiny. Then he did a double take. "Abraham, what have you done?" He held his hands over Destiny's belly. "May I?" Destiny nodded. "My God!" He laid both hands, bearing his trademark rings on all 10 fingers, on Destiny's baby bump, clad in a green maternity dress. "It's a miracle!" "It took some effort," I said. "And needles in sensitive places," Destiny added. I winced. "Kinky, but I'm not here to judge," Ludwig said. "I'm here to provide legal advice, such as it is. Tell me everything." We sat on the red sectional together, and I explained at length about idiot husband and about his insinuations that Ivan was rabid. Destiny sat next to me, smelling of lavender, and watching with interest. "Is your cat rabid?" he asked. I made a sound of disgusted dismissal and called, "Ivan!" Ivan trotted silently into the room with his tail in the air, all golden and friendly, and walked across the wooden floor to Ludwig for the petting that was obviously his due. He gazed up at Ludwig with bright bronze eyes, expectant. Ludwig shot me a sharp look. "Your pets? Seriously?" But he petted Ivan enthusiastically. And when Freddie trotted over too, claws clicking on the wooden floors, he patted him with equal glee. "Hello, Kitty, I'm your grandsire. And Puppy, I'm your great-grandsire." He pointed at Destiny's belly. "I have no idea how to describe our relationship." He turned back to me. "Anyway, he's adorable, but can you prove he's not rabid?" "Rabies spreads via saliva," Destiny said. "Freddie bit Ivan. Ivan didn't bite Freddie. Ergo, QED, STFU. "I like her," Ludwig said. "Keen legal mind. Have you considered a career in law?" "I like being a veterinarian." Ludwig shrugged. "I'm thinking a restraining order. 100 feet at all times. After all, the man is clearly unhinged." Destiny said, "He's just sad that he lost his dog." Ludwig stared at her for a moment. Then he turned to me. "I see." He turned back to Destiny. "I know, my dear, but we just want to make certain that he doesn't cause issues for your cat." "I'm not an idiot." "No one said you were. Quite the contrary, I should think." Either way, I don't think it will come to this. But if he convinces county officials that there's a rabid cat around, give them my card and a copy of the restraining order, and decline to surrender your pet without first consulting your attorney." He placed his card on the table and sat back in his seat. "As for payment, you know I can afford it." "Oh, Abraham, you know I don't want your money." He glanced at the ceiling for a moment and smirked. "Our firm's annual year-end party is coming up, and it would be such a coup if I could secure your services as entertainer." I winced yet again. "Oh, how lovely!" Destiny beamed. "I keep trying to convince him he should play for more people than just me." "I knew I liked you." Ludwig turned to me. "So, of course, in order to protect your darling offspring/pet, you'd be thrilled to perform for us. You're just profoundly insensitive sometimes. You know you love me just the way I am. He beamed at me. Your restraining order will arrive soon. I'll have one of our minions drop it by. He stood. We should all go to the symphony together at some point. He pulled me aside and said, May I ask you a question in private? I made an elaborate shrug, then told Destiny, Excuse us, and led Ludwig back to the kitchen with the black and white tiles and a blue gas stove. We sat at the kitchen table. Ludwig lowered his voice. Your pets and not your wife? I assume that you're planning on turning her after your odd reproductive experiments. I sighed. So far, she said no. Ludwig raised his eyebrows. She's a vegetarian, as if that explained everything. Perhaps it did. In the other room, Destiny turned on the television. Ludwig considered this for a moment. Do you want me to... No, I said, then lowered my voice. No, thank you. Are you not attached to her? He whispered. The opposite, I sighed and stared at the floor. It was the eternal paradox of my life. The best, kindest companions aren't the sort to choose this life. Flora had also been turned by someone who didn't ask permission for what it's worth. She'd even told me that she'd never liked meat because she had always felt sorry for the animals. I have a type. Can a person have more than one Beschert? Of course, any sort of predestination has some inherent theological problems, but I supposed I still found the idea of a soulmate hopelessly romantic. There was a long pause, and then he said, You and your mortals. I can't let myself get attached to mortals anymore. They're so fleeting. It hurts too much. I didn't really have anything to say in response to that. What would I say? I thought of Flora suddenly. The scent of her hair, the sound of her laughter, and the wave of it was almost overpowering. Maybe Ludwig was right. He patted me on the shoulder and walked towards the door, bundling up in his hat, gloves, scarf, and sunglasses, which were odd with his expensive suit. Was his suit SPF rated? I tell people we met at our support group for people with extreme sun sensitivity. Bye, Lou, Destiny said.
Destiny. Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey. October 18th, 2020. I was certain Ludwig was gay, and I was raised by lesbians and went to Pride every year as soon as I could walk and was by myself. Okay, he could have been a swishy straight man or a product of changing standards of male behavior over time or something, but based on the way he looked at my husband. It was overt enough to me that I suspected some women might be jealous, but it wasn't my way. I trusted my husband. Besides, I was 4 months pregnant. That meant I wanted to adopt every animal I saw, cried at the drop of a hat, and couldn't find my car keys. Also, sometimes I was horny, but mostly I was exhausted and over-sentimental and forgetful. Also, all dairy products smelled like feet. This was unfortunate, as only a few weeks ago I had craved dairy products. Speaking of feet, my feet hurt. Also my back. I was more inclined to ask someone to rub my feet than throw a jealous fit. I lay down on my side and nibbled on my latest craving, walnuts, and turned on the television and started flipping channels. I missed my TV buddy, Lucy. We were trying to be responsible, pandemic and all, but really we spent 8 hours a day together at the clinic, so how bad could it be? I'd Zoom call her later. I thought of Abraham's previous wife, Flora, again. I think that despite the mood swings, she would have wanted to do this too. I don't know how I knew that, but I just knew. It was probably more pregnancy hormones. Abraham and Ludwig left the kitchen, and I could almost hear the anime-obsessed manga girls from my college dorm squealing about bishies. Bishonen. Beautiful boys. Ludwig was stunning, by the way. Like, Marilyn Monroe gorgeous, only with no apparent awareness of his sex appeal. Maybe he was less gay than I thought. He was the only person on Earth who didn't realize how handsome he was. "Bye, Lou," I called, and he did a shy little wave. Definitely a manga boy.
Abraham, Berlin, Germany, May 31st, 1939. I can get you fake identity papers if you want them. Ludwig appeared nervous. He always looked nervous these days. To be fair, I probably did as well. I'd been anxious ever since Kristallnacht. He dressed like a Hollywood leading man, with the suit and the hat covering his impeccable blonde wig. I scowled at him. I'm done with lying. Ludwig scowled back, and we glared at each other. Then I rolled my eyes and stared at his wallpaper. It was a floral print, with enormous pink pseudo-oriental blossoms and twining green vines. He'd sold his beloved antique red sofa and purchased a pink one. Why? Because it was worth a ludicrous sum of money, and he was tired of hauling it around whenever he moved. The wooden end tables and the like were all painted green to complement the wallpaper. The apartment was in town, and we could hear the cars and the sound of voices downstairs. Finally, he said, I assume you have no interest in attending Wagner's Tristan and Isolde tonight? I don't forgive him for his essay, Judaism in Music. If you genuinely admire my so-called gift with the violin, surely you disagree with it. Seriously, if you haven't read it, it's incredibly offensive. Stuff about how Jews don't have a German soul and are therefore incapable of producing true music. Also, we can't speak European languages properly, and therefore we can't express genuine passion. Of course I disagree with it, he said. Lots of artists say stupid or offensive things. Even Mozart, who was the greatest composer in history, adored toilet humor and enjoyed signing letters, "Lick my ass." He shuddered theatrically. There have also been prominent artists, writers, and musicians in history who were devotees of the Greek sin, and we don't throw out their work either. I opined. Toilet humor and homosexuality were a lot less offensive to me than anti-Semitism. The sin of Sodom isn't sodomy in the Jewish tradition. It's hoarding resources and exploiting the poor. More than one blushing older man at the yeshiva tried to argue with my interpretation of the passage in Leviticus. You know, the one I think referred to the Greeks. Eventually, one whispered, I believe that you are mistaken, Averholm, but I'm too embarrassed to explain why. But I digress. In short, Wagner could lick my ass. Not that I was going to say that to Ludwig. So instead, I limited myself to another, Exactly, Ludwig said. Judge the artist's work, not the artist. His work is divine, even if his views are repugnant. Ludwig, I thought, was deeply repressed. I'd prefer not to attend. I encourage you to go, however. You love his work. I will then, Ludwig said prissily. Then do that, I said. I will, he answered. Good, I said, and picked up Ludwig's spare violin to practice.
Ludwig, Berlin, Germany, May 31st, 1939. It broke my heart to see Abraham so degraded. Oh, he was still beautiful, of course, but he looked tired and resigned, and I hated it. Of course, I hated all the laws about the Jews. All the Jews that I had met were kind, understanding people, but it hurt more with Abraham. I hoped music would take my mind off things, so I went to the opera, despite Abraham's regular condemnations of Wagner ringing in my ears. He hadn't condemned homosexuality, I noticed, but he hadn't exactly enthusiastically endorsed it either, which was to be expected. The rules against it came from Leviticus, a text that Christianity and Judaism shared. Also, Abraham clearly preferred the company of women. I'd watched him with his wife Flora from afar. They had been surprisingly affectionate in public. Not that I was certain why I cared. It was merely romantic friendship, after all. Unlike Abraham, I had never married, and I had never engaged in anything carnal myself. Vampires don't reproduce sexually, so there was no need. I sat in my box seat and waited for the opera, with the red velvet and the scent of cigarettes. To my intense annoyance, the men in the next box were talking during the opera. I wondered if it would be better or worse to lean around the wall and hush them. I did my best to ignore them, but I heard, "We can round them up, send them to work camps away from the prying eyes of the foreign press." Then I heard the deep voice of my maker. Not God, of course. Him. Thomas. I considered fleeing mid-opera, despite how rude that would be, but I needed to know their plans. I took a deep breath and listened, despite my mounting horror. Thomas asked if they could place him in charge of one of the camps, saying that he had a history in the penal system that would be of use. They discussed the camps they were talking about building, and of course Abraham couldn't work in direct sunlight. He would die. We needed to leave. The opera forgotten, I listened to the men in the next box talk through the rest of the performance. After, I waited until I thought they had left, then stood. I knew Thomas was in the lobby, and he shouldn't have been aware of me in the same way that I was aware of him. That wasn't his particular gift, it was mine. He wasn't leaving, so perhaps he had spotted me on the way in. Rather than wait all night, I walked out of my box and toward the exit. In the lobby, a tall, balding man with a frizzy fringe of dark hair stopped me. Thomas, of course, wearing a Nazi uniform. "Hello, Ludwig," he said, and the various soldiers around him became more interested in me. "Hello," I said politely. I didn't use a name because I didn't know which one he was using. Thomas clapped me on the shoulder and pulled me aside. "How have you been?" I mumbled I was fine. "Wonderful, wonderful." He steered me away from the crowd, out of earshot, and lowered his voice. "Can you believe this bunch of ridiculous pagans might actually do it? Of course, once they succeed, we'll have to be rid of them. They're practically witches and should all be burned at the stake, but marvelous." I was appalled, but muttered something polite and searched for the exit. If I'd been mortal, my heart would have been racing. Thomas lowered his voice. "Can you see your way clear to giving me another loan?" This irritated me out of my fear. I pursed my lips. "The term loan implies that you intend to pay me back." Thomas rolled his eyes at me. "How much cash do you have on you?" "No," I said. "You'll have to make me, here, in front of all these people." Thomas scowled at me. "The older you get, the more irritating you become." I tipped my hat to him. "I'll take that as a compliment." I edged out the door and slipped into the shadows, trying to prevent him from following me. I took a very roundabout way home.
Abraham, Berlin, Germany, June 1st, 1939. Ludwig returned from yet another Wagner opera, still in his fancy opera finery, but this time, instead of glowing, he was anxious. "Abraham, I think the two of us should move to America." He paced a little and sat next to me. "I heard things at the opera." I was sure he had. "I should hope you heard an opera," I said. Outside there were passing cars. The scent of exhaust drifted in through the open windows. Ludwig and I weren't neighbors anymore. They had forced me to move from Ludwig's building into a much worse one reserved for Jews. I'd been living with a sense of creeping dread for months. "Be serious!" He sat next to me on my cheap blue sofa and lowered his voice. "The Fuhrer requires his officers to attend Wagner operas, which they hate because they're all Philistines, so they chatted throughout the performance in the box next to me. At first I was angry that they were talking during a glorious performance and ruining it. But then I realized they were talking about imprisoning all of you." Then he added, as if I were too dense to understand, "All the Jews." I'd known what he meant. Horror and irritation did battle within me, and irritation won. "All of us. There are, thousands, tens of thousands of us?" I stood as it was my turn to pace on the threadbare beige carpet. "Really, Ludwig, you've been watching them systematically strip away all of my rights. They've burned and smashed and seized Jewish businesses. We've been barred from most professions. They're arresting us for no reason. People are chanting, protect Germany from the Jews on the street, and painting the word Juda and six-pointed stars on our homes and remaining businesses. We can neither be doctors nor receive medical attention. I can't walk down the street without people glaring or shouting harassment. But it's opera gossip that frightens you. Ludwig leaned over and put his face in his hands. You're infuriating. He'd asked me to leave the country months ago with him, after Kristallnacht. I didn't want to leave without Miriam. This had turned into debates about logistics, precisely how many family members we could bring with us. Miriam's husband David hadn't wanted to leave his aging parents. They didn't want to leave David's brother and David's brother's children and David's wife, Miriam and David's late brother's wife. I wished we could bring them all. It was agonizing to have to choose. I wanted to airlift the entire Jewish population out of Germany and couldn't. Ludwig agreed, but also felt that the larger the group, the more likely we would be caught. Fine, I said, defeated. Get paperwork for Miriam and her family and I'll go. Shanghai is the only place allowing Jewish refugees. We can go there. I felt a vast, swelling wave of bitter resignation. I was a German. This was my country too, and I resented being forced to flee my home. The sense of betrayal was complete. I don't want to go to Shanghai. I want to go to New York. And they'll let you in, even if I have to forge paperwork naming myself President of the United States. There was a long pause, and then he said, I saw Thomas, too. I stopped pacing at that. He looked up and ran his fingers through his hair, mussing it. He hates the Nazis. He thinks they're a bunch of pagans and heretics, practically witches, but they're close enough to his views on your people that he's working with them. And if Thomas is involved, we need to go. He knows me. He met my eyes. He turned me. I see. I supposed Thomas had been his mentor, much like Ludwig had been mine in the early days, for which he was still trying to make amends. I knew from Flora how important that relationship was. I'll get those papers, he said. He had an air of determination about him. I supposed tonight was the night. Abraham, Berlin, Germany, June 2nd, 1939. I went to visit Miriam that evening, intending to take her to Ludwig's basement for our future trip to America. It was Shabbat, and I had a standing invitation to Shabbat dinner. Obviously, I never joined them for dinner, as I can't eat, but I sometimes came after dinner to play card games and dolls with Miriam's children, Shlomo and Ruth, and to make silly faces at little Shayna. I could see my brother in Shlomo's features, especially the family's prominent nose, and they all had my family's coloring. Pale, tan skin, dark hair. I've been going more often since their bank was Aryanized, which meant that the government seized all their assets and handed them over to non-Jews. Miriam's husband David had committed suicide when they took his livelihood, so I was supporting them. Yes, my brother's bank, the one he founded in 1841, was Aryanized. The door was open, and no one was home. There was no sign of a struggle, just a dark house with empty spaces where furniture had previously stood, and children's rooms full of toys, and silence. I could smell a single glass of wine in the sink, and the waxy scent of the Shabbat candles. I didn't know what to do. Scour all the jails? I went home, deeply anxious. 2 soldiers were waiting for me inside my apartment. "You're under arrest!" The other one swung the butt of his rifle, striking me in the head with a loud crack and knocking me to the floor, and his partner started kicking me in the ribs. Isaac, my handsome tuxedo cat, hid under the sofa. Good. He was safer there. He was a direct descendant of my darling Deborah, by the way. I grabbed the man's foot and flung him into the far wall with a crash, then stood and grabbed the other man and bit him. I drank. Even when there was a loud bang and a sense of force to my back from the direction of his friend, I turned and lunged and grabbed him by the throat. "Where were you taking me?" "What are you?" He tried to maneuver the rifle to point at me. I slapped it out of his hand. Any regrets I might have had about taking a human life flew out of my head. Perhaps it was time to act like the monster I was. "Maybe you should have asked that before you shot me." I drank. I needed the blood to heal. Then I asked, "Where were you taking me?" "Train station. Work camp. Poland." I snapped his neck and ran through the dark cobblestone streets and found a small crowd of maybe 20 people at a train station under guard. I counted the guards. There were only 6 or 7. If they'd been closer together, I would have known that I could take them, but they were spread out. I was likely to be shot again. I could take multiple bullets, but what about the children? Miriam stood in the center, holding little Shayna. Shlomo and Ruth stood next to her, clinging to her skirt. There were young men, alert like they were looking for an opportunity to escape, and venerable old people and small children all standing on cobblestones next to train tracks in the moonlight. I sneaked up behind the first guard and silently broke his neck. I felt nothing. I was cold, perfect, and distantly aware that I should have been feeling emotions, but survival took precedence. I took his weapon and crept up behind another guard. I could hear the train in the distance, but had no idea how far away it was. I snapped the neck of the second guard and headed toward the third. I didn't think they'd noticed yet. As I approached the third, the lead man told Miriam, "I don't think your baby is worth a bullet. Hold still so I can use only one for both of you." Miriam turned her back on him, clutching 6-month-old Shayna to her chest and shaking, tears running down her face. "Please, please don't, please." She walked away towards the edge of the crowd. "Please don't, she's just a baby." I pointed my stolen weapon at him and aimed. He fired. There were screams and a spray of red and the scent of iron and blood-soaked children crying for their mother. "Miriam!" Faster than any mortal could track, I shot the lead man. I had a sense again that I would have feelings as soon as the situation was over, but that was a problem for future me. There were more of them, and they turned their guns on me. The prisoners screamed and ran except for Shlomo and Ruth, who sat on the ground next to their mother and sister and cried and shook their mother. My feelings gave one final sob and curled up into a whimpering ball, one that I could easily ignore for the time being. I lost count of how many bullets hit me. I was no longer human. I was a thing of teeth and speed, and I killed as many as I could. The first few bullets barely hurt, but the later ones felt like red-hot pokers. I ignored them and kept killing. I snapped necks, gnawed out a throat or two. I left their blood cooling in puddles on the ground, undrunk. I had no time for that. When I killed the last one, there were 5 or 6 people huddled in the street, and little Shlomo and Ruth crying next to their mother's body, and the little ball of bloody cloth that was their baby sister. I took their hands and called to the people to follow me and led them through dark, deserted streets into Ludwig's basement. I rushed up the stairs at inhuman speed to Ludwig to ask him to forge papers for them. "We need exit papers. Lots of them." His eyes widened at the sight of me. "How many?" he asked. I didn't know. I stared blankly at him. He rolled his eyes at me and followed me to the basement, radiating impatience. When he entered the room with the people I'd rescued, he stopped in his tracks. He counted 2 elderly couples, a sickly-appearing young man with thick glasses, and Shlomo and Ruth, who were still covered in blood. He spoke to them, quiet and gentle and reassuring, asking questions. He washed the blood off the children with a damp cloth from upstairs. He took notes and gave them clothing, backstories. Had he been storing clothes for Miriam and the children? I could feel an emotional storm approaching. I shoved it away, clinging to the icy perfection, and stared after him, silent. He went back upstairs and fussed over papers for about an hour, then stepped out. He returned with passage out of Germany for 7. 2 to Dublin for the elderly couple that were willing to pretend to be Catholic, 2 to Shanghai for the couple that wasn't. Train tickets to Calais with boat tickets from Calais to London for the sickly man and the children. He handed out the paperwork and the train and boat tickets and told the young man to pretend that Shlomo and Ruth were his children and to meet us at the docks in London. He walked them all to the boats or the train station himself and returned home calm and satisfied. He said, "It's time for us to leave. They shot Miriam. And Shayna." I was shaking now, but I wasn't sure whether it was rage or fear or despair. "All the more reason to leave. I'm going to kill them. All of them." Sure, the Talmud forbids taking revenge, but I didn't care at that point. I was ready to fight the entire army. They'd taken on the wrong monster. I wondered how many I could kill in a single night. And if they managed to kill me, well, that would stop the approaching storm, wouldn't it? Ludwig gave me a sharp look and sighed. "I'm sorry." He made a gesture in front of my face, thumb and 5th finger extended out, others curled almost like a child with a marionette, and I couldn't move. "Come with me." Golem-like, I followed him to the living room. A strange calm spread over me. My bullet wounds were closing up, and there was the occasional sound of something metal hitting the floor. He shuffled through a pile of papers, scowled and burned a few, finally settling on some he appeared to like. He wiped the blood off my face, neck, and hands, threw my clothes in the fire, bandaged my wounds, and dressed me in a girl's pink frilly dress, including styling my hair with pink ribbons, and girl shoes. I don't know where he got them or how he knew they'd fit. He thrust papers into my hands. "My cat," I said. "Oh, he sighed and made the marionette gesture again. "Stay here." I sat on his sofa, the new pink one, and wondered if I was dripping blood on it. After a while I realized I wasn't bleeding, but my body was expelling the bullets one by one. They landed on the sofa, the floor. I sat in silence, with only the occasional sound of metal bouncing off wood. After some time he returned, covered with blood, carrying a yowling Isaac by the scruff in one hand and my Stradivarius in the other. He handed me the cat, who immediately calmed. He stared into my eyes and made the gesture again. "I need you to be a young girl, one who doesn't necessarily respect her father. Roll your eyes a lot, but don't talk to anyone. These papers aren't invented identities, they're stolen identities, and I need you to play your part. Your name is Bettina Weber, by the way." I rolled my eyes at him and stood, and a few bullets fell out of my dress. He washed and changed and put on an attitude of an older man. Something in his posture, perhaps. Flora would have been envious of his transformation. He examined me carefully before we left. I definitely wasn't bleeding anymore. We boarded a Norddeutscher Lloyd ship, headed to New York via Cork, with Ludwig handling the paperwork, the luggage, and the Stradivarius, and me holding the cat and rolling my eyes a lot. A German soldier tried to flirt with me, but I just looked bored and stared silently at him until he slunk away. Aside from the flirty soldier, no one glanced at us twice. The spell wore off halfway across the channel, and I stood up. I walked over to him, shaking in rage, and said, "I'm going back as soon as we land. Fuck my homeland, fuck humanity, fuck everything." Ludwig gazed at me with an expression of pure pity and said, "I'm sorry, but you're not," and made the gesture again. Damn him. My emotions calmed again, so at least there was that. But I wanted to kill. I wanted to tear my way through the German army and leave nothing but gore in my wake. I wanted to die in an orgy of destruction. We disembarked at Cork, despite Ludwig's having purchased passage to New York, and boarded a Cunard White Star liner to London. When we arrived in London, the young man with the glasses was waiting for us, holding Shlomo and Ruth's hands. Ludwig gave him a giant roll of money. I was still wearing the pink dress. Shlomo and Ruth didn't seem to notice. "You are one of the righteous among the nations," the young man said, weeping, and hugged Ludwig. Ludwig was stiff and awkward with the hug, but his expression was soft. Ludwig asked Shlomo and Ruth, "Are you hungry?" They shook their heads, silent. He asked me, "Would you like to visit Flora's grave while we're here?" I just stared at him. I wanted to kill. We took a carriage to Kensal Green Cemetery. There were weeping angels over Flora's and the children's graves in white marble. I handed Isaac to Ludwig and placed a rock on each tombstone. Christians do flowers. We do rocks. Shlomo and Ruth watched, silent. The angels were weeping for Miriam and Shana, not these stone angels, the actual angels. I was shaking again now, and I let out a shriek of rage and grief that would have had heads turning our way if it weren't the middle of the night. I flung myself onto Flora's grave. Ludwig quickly made the gesture again and shushed me. I didn't want to be calm, but I had no choice. "We're bringing the children with us," I said. Ludwig made a face. "I suppose I forged them paperwork." We returned to the docks and boarded a boat to New York a few hours before dawn, also Cunard White Star. We loaded Shlomo and Ruth onto the boat with us, allegedly the teenaged girls' cousins. I switched my identity back to a young man once we boarded, much to my relief. I hadn't enjoyed being Bettina Weber. I curled up in the fetal position on the bunk, shaking, and refused to respond to Ludwig's questions. He placed a cool hand on my shoulder and murmured, "I'm here." I don't know how long we sat like that. Isaac curled up next to me, for which I was grateful. As the sun rose outside, he shook me gently and asked in a soft voice, "Abraham?" I made a rude gesture at him. He patted my shoulder and said, "Are you hungry, children?" There was a pause, and then he said, "I think you should eat whether or not you're hungry. Let's go up to the dining room together." They left, and while they were gone, I pulled myself together. If it was morning, it might be time to say Shacharit and the mourner's Kaddish. I wanted to pray for Miriam and Shana. I missed the kind people of the synagogue in Whitechapel and arranged a prayer group on the boat. I didn't have a prayer book on me, but some of the other passengers did. I realized I knew most of it by heart at the end of the first service. Unfortunately, there weren't 10 Jews on the boat, so we couldn't say Kaddish. The children were too young to count for a minyan. Neither of the children spoke a word the entire voyage. Abraham, Manhattan, New York, December 21st, 2020. It was a year-end party, but they might as well have called it a Christmas party, because they played Christmas Muzak before the party and had decorated with Christmas trees, tinsel, and balls. They covered the tables with white tablecloths and silvery place settings. Nary a Hanukkah in sight. Not that it was still Hanukkah, that had ended 3 days ago. Nor was any other winter holiday represented. Speaking as a religious minority, if your only accommodation to non-Christians is to say holiday instead of Christmas, just say Christmas. You're not fooling anyone, except perhaps yourself. Joke. What day is Hanukkah this year? The same day it always is, the 25th of Kislev. I played my way through the classics, opening and closing with Paganini. Ludwig's legal firm seemed to appreciate my playing based on the smiles, foot taps, and applause. Destiny sat in the front row, beaming and clapping enthusiastically whenever I paused playing. She was wearing a sparkly, purple maternity evening gown. Who even knew such a thing existed? And a mask, of course. Most of us were masked if we weren't actively eating and drinking. "Curtain call!" Ludwig shouted. "Yes!" Destiny shouted. I wondered for a moment what I should play. "I think I know just the piece. Have you ever wondered what a legal contract would sound like on a violin?" I could pick out by the smiles who here was Jewish. This is a legal contract with a traditional melody from the Jewish tradition called Nidre. I played. The story goes that during the era of forced conversions, many Jews felt so guilty about converting that they needed absolution from this and to be released from their vows on our Day of Atonement. Kol Nidre means all vows, and in it we preemptively apologize for any vows in the next year that we cannot keep. It fell out of favor with the rabbis in the 19th century, and Reform synagogues tried to ban it, because it was taken out of context and used to slander us as faithless and liars. With my history of pretended conversion, it resonated with me. The attempt to ban it failed, partly because it's haunting and sad and beautiful, and partly because Jews don't give up traditions easily. Afterwards, I went to the open bar and ordered red wine, because my beer options were all boring. 2 teenage boys giggled next to me. They both had beers, and they both looked too young to have beers. The bartender, a young man with visible tattoo sleeves under his uniform shirt, kept giving them a sour glance. I wondered what the story behind that was, but didn't feel it was my place to ask. I didn't want to get the bartender in trouble if he was involved somehow. The first boy, who had acne and braces, said, "My SS name is Unterwaffen Husenlader." He was wearing too much body spray under his ill-fitting suit. The second boy, who was dark-haired and dressed in an expensive suit with the tie untied and top shirt button unbuttoned, answered, "My SS name is Uberwaffel Hattenrobberhusen." They burst into giggles. Hilarious. I found Ludwig's eye across the room and gave him my most annoyed look. He winced and came over. "Are you enjoying the party?" I glanced over at the boys and then rolled my eyes. Ludwig put on his most avuncular smile and asked, "Hello, boys. Are you enjoying the party?" The smile went well with the suit. You can take the man out of the Rococo era, but you can't take the urge to peacock yourself about in something wildly expensive out of the Rococo era man. He even still had his habit of wearing rings on all 10 fingers. He also wore a wristwatch that cost more than most people's cars. The boy with the acne put his beer behind his back and bit his lip. The other boy said, "It's okay for old people." I took my wine from the bartender, took a sip, and said in what I thought was a very mild and patient voice, "The Holocaust isn't funny." Ludwig's eyes became enormous, but he said nothing. "Are you Jewish?" the dark-haired boy asked. The boy with acne blushed. "Yes," I said. There was a brief pause, and then the dark-haired boy rallied. "Then why aren't you laughing? I thought Jews were supposed to be funny." "I guess I didn't get the memo," I said with passive-aggressive false calm. I took another tart sip of wine. "Are you sure you're Jewish? You don't have any Jewish traits. I'll bet you don't think the sight Cats That Look Like Hitler is funny either." I raised my eyebrow at him and took another sip of wine. Not enough that they thought they were driving me to drink, but enough that, hopefully, they knew I didn't consider that comment worthy of a response. "Little boy, I've been needled by far more obnoxious people than the likes of you. Unsatisfactory effort." Excuse me, Ludwig said. Who's your father? My mother is Mary Richmond, the boy answered. Maybe you've heard of her? She's a partner. What, are you going to talk to her about whether I'm sensitive enough to the help? In the background, the bartender scowled. I gave him a sympathetic glance. No, Ludwig said. I'm going to discuss whether you're being polite to my guest. What, are you gay? The boy asked. Ludwig smiled, the smile where his eyes went dark and you could see a faint hint of fang. There was a moment where they stared at each other, the dark-haired boy looking like a rabbit who was staring into the eyes of a fox. He said, certainly the wittiest thing he'd said all night. Ludwig gave him a hard stare and waved his hand at him, and the boy scattered. Destiny waddled over with her hand on her belly and kissed me on the cheek. You were inspired, as always. I smiled and murmured thanks. If you'll excuse me, Ludwig said, I need to speak to Mary for a moment. I'll be right back. He rushed away. Is something wrong? Destiny asked. Just some teenagers who think they're funny, I said. Destiny scanned the crowd and noticeably picked out the boy with acne nervously standing behind his mother and the dark-haired boy watching Ludwig beeline towards his mother with an expression of chagrin. The woman Ludwig spoke to, presumably Mary, scowled toward her son and mouthed something that looked suspiciously like, "You're in big trouble." Ludwig headed back to hover protectively at my side, which was equal parts endearing and annoying. He leaned over to the bartender and asked in an almost conspiratorial tone, "What's the best wine you have back there?" We both gave him enormous tips.
You've been listening to the Immortal Gifts Podcast, and I'm your host and author, Catherine Villiard. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happened next, and please rate the podcast to help other people find it. See you next time, and remember, becoming a vampire is a thing that can just happen to you, but being a monster is a choice.